This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The Demography of Demons. That's straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. You have blessed us with your support during our first year in ministry. You literally make it possible for us to do what we do. And so as we prepare to head into a new year, we want to return the blessing to you. Through January, we've prepared a number of special offers at the Gilbert House store, and we're featuring the Red Wing Saga, Sharon's wonderful series of supernatural thrillers that teaches spiritual warfare through masterful storytelling with fascinating historical mysteries as the backdrop. Now, all 8 novels in the Red Wing Saga, a $160 value, can be yours for just $110, a savings of $50. You'll also find the Derek Gilbert collection, all 5 of my nonfiction books, a $100 value for just $70. Those are just 2 of the special offers available through January at our online store. You'll find it at gilberthouse.org/store. And as always, we thank you for your prayers and your support. We know Jesus cast out a lot of demons. The apostles did the same, but what do we really know about them? And how did they come to be? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. We're going to try to get through, in this program, a discussion of angels and demons and the hierarchy of the netherworld and, well, the spirit realm, actually. We had talked about doing this a couple of months back, decided to hold off the program until this month, and I think we're finding with the research that we've done behind the scenes that this is probably not going to happen in just one show, but we'll see how far we get. Please take a moment, by the way, before I forget to remind you that our free app gets you all of our content and also protects you against us being, canceled. Just in case we say something. If you're watching on YouTube, God bless you. Please click subscribe and click a little bell for notifications. Share the link around with your friends. But don't be surprised if someday we say something that might get us deplatformed. When you're playing in someone else's sandbox and not paying for the privilege, they can do that to you. So just be prepared. If you've got our free app, which is hosted by and developed by a Christian company, and they host all of our content, they will not cancel us. So all of our stuff is there. Not just this program, but our weekly Unraveling Revelation broadcast, our weekly podcast, PID Radio, and we're uploading archives now going back to 2005. So Sharon and I calculated the other day that we're somewhere on the upper side of 2,100 broadcasts of various types going back to 2005. So plenty of content being moved over to this app. You'll find it at our website, gilberthouse.org/app, gilberthouse.org/app, and that gets you all of our content. It is free to use, and we truly appreciate you checking it out. It's got some other great features, too, like a Bible, an audio Bible, no less, with multiple translations. So you can read along, you can listen along, and take advantage of that. Now, joining us, our esteemed panel for our monthly Iron and Myth roundtable discussion. This is truly a blessing to get to host this every month. First, our friendly neighborhood PhD, the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, author of such books as Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, Dr. Judd Burton, a best-selling author and award-winning screenwriter, author of several series of fiction that incorporates good theology, Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, and Chronicles of the Apocalypse. He is online at Godawa.com. We welcome Brian Godawa, and the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder, Colorado, author of such books as Giants, Sons of the Gods, The Angel of the Lord, a biblical, historical, and theological study, and more. You'll find him online at douglasvandorn.com, Pastor Doug Van Dorn. Well, fellas, the first conversation, Iron and Myth of 2023. This is going to be somewhat speculative, but should be pretty exciting. This is really some fascinating stuff as we dig into a topic where there's been a lot of speculation over the last couple thousand years as to who or what is it that occupies the unseen realm, and what can we learn about the unseen realm and its denizens from Scripture. There aren't, we've got the basic categories of angel and demon, but beyond that, where do we go from there? I mean, cherubim, seraphim, ophanim, in the New Testament, we got powers, principalities, thrones, dominions. Who wants to jump in here? What do we make of this? All right, I'll point somebody and throw you under the bus. Judd, you go first.
The doctor speak. It does sort of, the topic does sort of beg for a taxonomy, a hierarchy, and it's relatively clear in Scripture that there's a hierarchy. In some places more than others, but for me, that journey started with Paul's material in the New Testament. Of course, I'm dialing it back all the way to my childhood, my sort of foundational instruction in the Bible. And, all of us are familiar with that breakdown in Ephesians chapter 6. I think that's, for a lot of believers, that's where the hierarchical journey really begins. And I think Paul does a good job of kind of presenting the field manual education, if you will, on the hierarchy of the unseen realm in that passage in particular.
I don't know about you guys, but I'll speak for myself. This whole idea of dominions, thrones, powers, authorities that Paul talks about. When I used to think about the unseen realm, those, and I don't know why this is, I can't really explain it, but I never thought about those things as being part of it.
Huh.
I think I had a very simplistic view of basically just angels and demons.
Yes, me too. Me too. I mean, for the longest time, I think a lot of us do, angels and demons. And demons are fallen angels.
Right. Exactly.
Is also the common misunderstanding biblically.
And so that kind of means that really there's only angels, if you put it that way. And an angel is it's a creature. It's not a function. So like almost everything that I believed about the unseen realm was pretty much simplistic and wrong.
I don't remember hearing anything about angels or demons growing up in church. We were at a kind of a high church. It was United Church of Christ back in Chicago, and then we moved out of the city and went to an evangelical Lutheran church. But I don't remember angels or demons ever coming into the conversation, other than, every now and then Satan would get mentioned when he, tempted Jesus and that kind of thing. But it never, they were never discussed in the context of these are entities who, even though we can't see them with our natural eyes, may still have some influence on the world around us and on you particularly. I think that's probably the default setting of most American Christians.
I think you're right, Derek. And I mean, based on my experience, based on some of the interviews that I've had with people talking about this as well, it seems to be fairly universal.
Yeah. And I think that it's also easily, and I'm more in this camp too, is that it's more acceptable to speak of it in terms of in the past, and particularly even in the Old Testament. It's like, oh, okay, well, if they're there in the Old Testament, that's okay. But in our everyday world now, it's much more difficult to accept that as being a reality, And I do think that there's there's like worlds of Christians that are separate, the sort of typical evangelicals where at most it's a theological issue and that's about it. And then there's the charismatic Pentecostal and that kind of stuff where they sort of like really stress that and have a whole sort of life view that incorporates the angels and demons and such, and it tends to be polarized, I think, in some ways, and then now I think that there's a whole new category, which is sort of us guys or, whatever or as I like to call it, the Nephilim nuts. So in other words, those who are more now attuned and akin to this understanding of the supernatural. The Heiser sort of opened the door for all of us and for a lot of us, but he's a good touch point for that. But so I think that's a whole new sort of paradigm that also opens up to even more categories than I think the traditional Pentecostal demon possession and demon stuff the understandings. It's opened up that understanding. Now, did one of you guys had sent a paper for us to read, to look at? The Hierarchy of Angels. Who was that?
Yeah, I sent that along. That was something that was developed by a deliverance minister back more than 15 years ago, Dr. Tom Hawkins. He's since gone home to be with the Lord, and he was recommended to me by Mike Heiser. So,
okay.
And this was back in 2005 or 6, and I thought, okay, now wait a minute. Because I was still very early in this journey. I didn't realize that a biblical scholar credentialed, with a PhD would actually take deliverance ministry seriously. And as we've learned, obviously he does. He's supportive of the work of one ministry in particular that works with people who are dealing with those kind of issues. And that's a central theme in his novels, The Portent and The Facade and The Portent. So when Mike directed me to this fellow, I paid attention. I contacted Dr. Hawkins and asked if he'd be interested in an interview because I wanted to learn, and he was not interested in really publicizing what he was doing. And, give him credit for that. He wasn't trying to sensationalize it. But the basic point of his paper, if as I understood it, was that, and we see hints of this in Scripture, that there are some entities that are so powerful that we can really bring trouble on ourselves if we're not careful about how we approach interacting with them. That's what I took away from it. Now, I sent you guys the paper and then I didn't go back and reread it myself. So, forgive me. I went and dug into some other research.
Yeah, I think we should go back anyway and just talk about these categories, or this hierarchy, at least biblically, before we do any speculative.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever run across, this was something that Mike put out, I think back in about 2008. So this was before he kind of had his big following through the unseen realm, and it was on his personal blog. And this is one of the first things I ever read from him. It was a little series called Parsing the Dead, where he goes through these different Old Testament words and what they are, the categories. And I was so worried that he might lose that website or whatever that I saved it way back then. So I still have a copy of that, and it's been helpful to me over the years because it was really kind of the first thing that I saw anybody ever doing that was trying to think through biblically the categories of who these creatures were. And that's what really started getting me to think, well, maybe there's more going on the other side than I ever thought.
Do you think that some of the that he's expanded that into his books, Angels, and then the second book, Demons, as he brought some of that out?
He's definitely brought some of it into it. Yeah. Oh. I couldn't tell you the page or verse, but
right.
We're certainly going to talk about some of these words, I think.
So, let's start with one very basic question. If demons are not angels, then what are they and where do they come from?
Yeah. Well, strictly speaking, biblically, if you look at if you look into it biblically, this notion that demons are fallen angels is not true. There's no real biblical foundation for it. However, what are they? And as far as I can see, the Bible doesn't actually say anything about their origins, and it really only describes them as, incorporeal spirits. And of course, in the Old Testament, there's really no reference to demons. Maybe you could argue Saul was possessed by a spirit of some kind or something. But that's the only instance, which is very interesting to me. And as I believe there's something theological going on there. We can get into that later, but messianic. But and then in the New Testament, they seem to be incorporeal spirits who are in seek of some kind of habitation of bodies. And they're just described as evil spirits. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Is there anything else you guys want to add to that? But it seems to me like that's the only thing we can see, strictly biblically speaking.
Evil spirits and also unclean spirits. So there's definitely something about their, there's a ritual purity element. I think to that definition. If we're building a definition of demon here, and staying within the confines of the biblical text gives us that. It's then that we have to start looking at extra biblical material that's referenced in the canon scripture to kind of give us some insight into that belongs to the same, in this case, the older Jewish tradition. But yeah, that always stuck with me is the preponderance of of usage of that phrase in the New Testament, unclean spirit.
Very good point. Now, do any of you guys know about the, I don't know, the history, the origins of how Christians, came to call them fallen angels? Is it just a sort of my only understanding of it, it just seems to be a typical sloppy, sort of cultural, how we tend to sort of simplify things into sloppy terms that become ineffectual, technically speaking, you know what I mean? Just like the word angel itself, angel is this concept of winged beings and such, and while cherubim and seraphim have wings, it's like angels in the Bible aren't described as having wings. They're not the cherubs, the little babies. We've talked about this before, obviously, but still, for the sake of those in the audience who may not have discussed this at any length, none of those things are in there. And the word angel actually is a word that means messenger. And so while it is connected to spiritual beings, there are many times where it's not connected to spiritual beings, because the main point is it's a messenger, usually of God in some way, right? So there's no wingedness to it necessarily. They might, but it's not biblically defined that way, right? So angels are these like sort of messengers of God. They can be spiritual. They may be like we're angels of God. Christians are angels because we bring the message of the gospel. But strictly speaking, this angel, the Malachim, like in the Old Testament, it's something that we've put a lot of cultural baggage onto. And by the way, I'm not against that, because I have them. I kind of have some of that in my own novels and stuff. I don't have the wings, but so that angel thing. So then when Christians think of demons, I think there's a natural tendency, as I learned it, again, I think just a sloppy introduction to it, that they're fallen angels. They're the ones that Revelation, where the tail of the dragon sweeps and they fall to the earth, and 1/3 of the heavenly host, and so those must be the fallen angels, right? And that those are therefore demons. But that's really important to understand that is not truly biblical, because if the demons, which are disembodied spirits, and angels, which biblically speaking, angels actually do have bodies. They're not the same as human flesh, like Jude talks about strange flesh, right? It's not the same flesh, but it is a flesh. And Genesis 6 says they can have sex with humans. Again, that's another controversial thing, not in our quarters here, but they also can eat, because the angels have visited Lot. They ate food, so they actually have bodies and can somehow, if you look strictly at the biblical information, whatever dimension they are in, the Elohim dimension, the spiritual dimension, they evidently also can be cross-dimensional, and they can eat actual physical food. They can have physical contact with us. They can have sex with humans. So there's a physicality, but as far as I can see, the only thing biblically speaking is they have heavenly flesh, whatever that means. And it's a kind of flesh that can go between the physical and spiritual realms, kind of like when Jesus could walk through walls after he resurrected, I guess. So biblically speaking, that's about all that I can find. But what that means is that while angels then do have some kind of heavenly flesh, some kind of body, therefore, by definition, evil spirits who are without bodies cannot be angels. And so they are a different being. And angels are sometimes referred to as spirits, but just like we are spirits, right? We're spirits, maybe in bodies. So there's that spiritual dimension that angels are in, but they're not strictly speaking spirits without bodies. And so that's an important distinction, that therefore when you come to, then demons are not fallen angels because they don't have bodies, they're looking for bodies, makes them a completely different category of being than what this sloppy, I would call it the sloppy evangelical, that's my background, Maybe it's also Roman Catholic, I don't know, but it's sloppy evangelical exegesis of what angels and demons actually are. That's at least a beginning point, I think.
I think it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be a word that is specifically translated demon in Hebrew. And the Jews did not have a word for demon.
What about Shadim?
Well, see, you mentioned Shadim, but Shadim is kind of a protective spirit. When you look at the cognates in Akkadian, that was like the Lamassu, those giant winged bulls that stood outside the palace at Nineveh, for example. Those were a type of Shadim. You've got the Seirim, translated goat demons, in the Bible, but again, those are embodied things apparently. And it's not clear that those are, where or what those things are. I mean, what is a goat demon anyway, or a satyr, or a donkey satyr, or donkey centaur, or centaur? We don't know because, again, you've only got 3 references to that word. One reference to Seirim in Leviticus 17, and 2 references to Shadim, one in Deuteronomy 32 and one in Psalm 106. So, considering that the Mesopotamians had a pretty robust cosmology and a demonology in Akkadian and Sumerian magical texts, it's kind of surprising to me that the Jews didn't have one. The Hebrews didn't have a role for demons in their cosmology, really. That it didn't really seem to get defined until Jesus appeared on the scene in the 1st century, and maybe that's not coincidental.
Yeah, if I can, I'm going to read those quickly because I do think this is important. A little bit of depth to this. Deuteronomy 32:17. He's talking about Mrs. Moses' thing. He's talking about how the Israelites went to Canaan and they worshipped the false gods. And he says these Israelites sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. And then the passage in Psalm 106, 37, they sacrificed their sons and daughters. It's the same concept to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of our sons and daughters, to the idols of Canaan. So what this goes into the paradigm that we all here kind of support, and that is this notion that there is some spiritual reality to the false gods of Canaan, for example. So these false gods of Canaan, Baal, Asherah, whatever, there's some kind of real spiritual reality to them. Now, how deep that goes, are there specific entities for every god or not? That's something to talk about. But on the surface, I think what's important that I think supports what you're saying, Derek, is that the word demons is helpful here, but it's not the best translation because it gives people the notion that they're spirit beings floating around without bodies, but that's not it. So I tend to say that the best way of interpreting this contextually is they were demonic, meaning they're evil of the spiritual realm. They're not demons as they are in the New Testament. They are demonic spiritual beings that we all see as connected to the Watchers or the gods of the nations who have real spiritual reality behind them. Those are the only 2 places where demons is used. And then, I mentioned the one thing about the evil spirit with Saul. I don't know of any other situations where that comes up.
So we got a lot of things going on here. I wanted to address one more issue that we brought up at the very beginning in terms of other things that the scripture might say about them, especially the Old Testament. And this isn't specific, but in terms of the word demon, but I wanted to get your guys' thought on it because we do have several passages that talk about the Rephaim being in Sheol. And those are connected universally with the Jews of Jesus' day and then of the earliest church with the demons. So if that's true, then I would think that would have to add at least a tiny bit more to what the scripture says about demons.
Fair enough.
What do you guys think about that?
I think that's a valid conclusion, and certainly when you compare it to when you start looking at this stuff linguistically, like the occupants of Sheol, for instance, the Rephaim, when you start comparing it to similar kinds of underworld deities, underworld spirits like you find in Mesopotamia and all along the coast of the Levant, and even into all the way into Turkey, even. I think that starts to make a lot of this stuff pop to life and into reality. when you see that linguistic connective tissue. And I touched on this in a paper that I wrote last year about words that were used in Eurasian languages for rulers, that they were all, in one way, shape, or form, they shared this initial R vowel morpheme that carried the residue, if you will, of this idea of veneration, to borrow a title from a very excellent book on the subject, veneration of these things in the underworld, in this case, Sheol or the Absu.
Well,
So,
I was going to.
Do you think that we can conclude, Judd, that there is biblical reason to say that the Rephaim are demons? Or can you only keep that in the realm of just what the cultures of those days thought?
I don't. Are you saying that the two have to be mutually exclusive?
No, I'm not saying they have to be mutually exclusive, but what I'm saying is, in order to make an argument, because we haven't said it explicitly tonight, we said it other nights, but everybody in the early church and all the early Jews believed that the demons were the disembodied Nephilim. So they're not the fallen angels; they're the disembodied spirits of their progeny. So the idea is, where did they get that from? And what I'm asking the question is, could they have derived that from the Bible, or did they necessarily also have to have the help of the cultures around them in order to get that idea?
I think it was the cultures around them. I think it was the cultures around them, and this was, and thank you, Judd, for hinting at the book Sharon and I wrote, Veneration, and I cited the paper that you wrote, by the way, on the reference to the Rephaim in my book Second Coming of Saturn. But one of the things that surprised us when we were researching veneration and this idea of venerating the dead was how prevalent this was in the cultures around ancient Israel. When you start looking at the text out of Ugarit and realize that these Amorites at the time of the Judges were actually had a temple in their city that was devoted to the council of the Ditanu, which was this underworld, these underworld deities connected to the Rephaim, and that Ditanu, according to scholar Amar Anus, is where the Greeks got the name of their old gods, the Titans, who were, the old gods who formerly ruled before they were overthrown by the Olympians and banished to Tartarus. Peter in 2 Peter 2:4 says that those angels who sinned, the reference back to Genesis 6, were the entities that had been banished by God to Tartarus. And in the Old Testament, every time we see, this is the thing that surprised us, when we see references to the prohibitions on sacrificing children, and this comes back to Psalm 106, sacrificing children specifically to Molech. It's connected in Leviticus 20, verses 1 through 6, and also in Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12, connects the practice of sacrificing children to Molech to the practice of turning to mediums and necromancers. In other words, trying to consult the spirit realm, specifically the spirits of the dead, for information. And I cited something that Mike Heiser wrote in Second Coming of Saturn, the unifying principle of verses 1 through 6. This is Leviticus 20, verses 1 through 6, a prohibition against sacrificing to Molech, using mediums, necromancers, and so forth, is not merely illegitimate cultic practices, but the practice of the cult of the dead. This realization makes sense also of the condemnation of the guilty party's entire clan in verse 5. We saw at Mari and Ugarit, those were major city-states in the ancient Near East. The cult of the dead is a family affair to secure the blessings and avert the wrath of past family for the sake of the family present and yet to be. Now in Psalm 106, the reference there to sacrificing children to demons, you go up a few verses to verse 28, and we find that the reason God sent the plague that killed 24,000 Israelites on the plains of Moab before they crossed over and attacked Jericho was because they were eating sacrifices offered to the dead. That was part of the worship of the cult of Baal Peor. And that word Peor, in that context, it's based on a Hebrew word that means gap or cleft or opening. And in this context, meaning's probably the entrance to the netherworld. So Baal Peor was the lord of the entrance to hell. And the Israelites had been drawn into that worship by eating sacrifices they were offering to the dead. So this appears to be part and parcel of this practice of sacrificing children to Molech. And I think the reason that we don't see references specifically to demons in the Old Testament is because English language translators looked at Rephaim and didn't understand what the Rephaim were to the ancient Israelites and their neighbors. They didn't realize this was a special class of spirit in the afterlife that was believed to be the ancestral spirits, specifically the ancestors of the royal houses of the Amorites, who had to be sacrificed to and appeased in order to secure their blessing. And then, of course, you had the household deads. Those were represented by the teraphim, which Jacob's wife stole from her father. David's wife, Michal, had one of them in their bedroom, which is how David escaped the agents of Saul. This was a thing that affected Israel down to Isaiah was condemning the practice of eating forbidden food amongst the tombs. And I don't think it's a coincidence when Jesus cast out the demons from the Gerasene demoniac. We are legion, for we are many. Who was living amongst the tombs. There was a herd of pigs right next door. I found a French scholar, who argues that the only reason pigs, which were forbidden, unclean in many other cultures in the ancient Near East, the only reason they were even raised, was to offer as sacrifices to the dead. So I think it's been hiding in plain sight in the Bible, but it's just been translated out because instead of say the Rephaim rise up to greet Lucifer when he's cast out of heaven, is because it's translated shades.
Yeah, there's another element of this though too that is what I call demonization, where the Hebrew. And I don't know if you guys would necessarily all agree with this, but I also wrote about the cult of the dead in my novel Jezebel and its corresponding book, The Spiritual World of Jezebel and Elijah. The cult of the dead, and there's another component in the Canaanite, certainly mythology of Rephaim, which is that they believe that the Rephaim was a reference to the ancient mighty kings who had died, and they were in Sheol, or however they called the underworld, the Canaanites did. And so these kings were down there, and so when there was a new king, they would engage in a cult of the dead ritual that would call upon the approval of the Rephaim kings in Sheol, right, to get the approval of the new king and the acceptance of the old king dying to go down into that world, right?
Right. The last king of Ugarit, when he died, they had this ritual. That's one of the texts that have been translated. It was like KTU 1.161 or something, a ritual basically to summon the old kings to come back and escort this last guy down to down to join the Council of the Ditanu, the Council of the Titans.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is in my novel Jezebel, by the way. That whole ritual I put in there.
Sweet.
But seriously though, so like for example, in Isaiah 14, there is a component in which I think sometimes the Bible refers to ancient mythologies, and they demonize them. And for instance, I mean, that's kind of what's going on with the, Amar Anus, talked about the Mesopotamian origins of the Apkallu, and he makes the argument that that's kind of what they're doing in Genesis 6. They're demonizing the same mythology, right? And so in Isaiah 14, the Sheol, verse 9, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you. So first of all, Isaiah is condemning the king of Babylon. And he's saying, you're going to die and you're going to go down to those mighty kings that rouses the shades, or the Rephaim, as Derek said. It's not apparent in the translation, which is not a good thing. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. Mm-hmm. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. This is a mockery, actually, that's going on. He says, all of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. The sound of your harps, maggots, are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. And he goes into, oh, how you are fallen, oh star, day star, morning star, son of the dawn. This is that passage that many people believe is reference to Lucifer. Mm-hmm. I don't, but that's okay.
I'm with you.
I do actually use it in the new. I'm writing a movie about Jesus called Messiah. And I'm trying to incorporate a few of these little things we have in there. I don't know if they're going to go for it, but I actually do use that sort of storyline because we have a Lucifer, or we have a Hasatan character that I call the accuser. I'm trying to make him change the name from Satan to the accuser, right? So I accept it to a certain degree if it, for the story, but I'm off topic. I'm sorry. So my point here is that passage to me is, it takes their mythology and it mocks it, and it says, oh yeah, okay, you're going to die, you're going to be accepted by these kings, but actually it's weakness because you're dead, you're weak, your bed is a bed of maggots. It's the opposite of what you think it is. And so I actually think that that's powerful. Again, this is my, what do you call it? My bang that I drum all the time. This is a subversion going on where they incorporate the pagan mythology, but they subvert it, or you can call it demonization. It's like the thing that you call these mighty kings, these mighty Rephaim, they're actually demonic. They're actually weak, worthless, useless shades. They're not mighty kings. That's kind of, and I'm not saying that that's always the case, but that's certainly the case in a few of these passages that I've seen, if that makes any sense.
We also see something similar in Ezekiel 32, a polemic against the king of Egypt, where he says that he's going to fall down and be sent to Sheol, where in the midst of Sheol you've got the mighty chiefs, the chiefs of the Gibborim shall speak of them with their helpers out of the midst of Sheol. I get a little speculative on that in Second Coming of Saturn. I argue that Assyria is there, that I suggest that that's actually Ashur, or Enlil, or El, or Dagon, or Molech. It's a reference to that particular entity. But again, I admit that's really speculative. But I do think it's interesting that you've got these mighty chiefs, and then when you look at the Septuagint translation, rather, which was the leading Jewish religious scholars of the Second Temple period, 3rd century BC, translated this and understood that those entities that they're calling the mighty chiefs are the giants who had fallen from eternity, who descended into Hades with their weapons of war. So it's clear that they made that connection, that these are the giants destroyed in the flood who are in the midst of Sheol, and Assyria, there's in the uttermost reaches of the pit, as far away as you can get from the midst. It's almost like they've got pride of place, these mighty chiefs or chiefs of the Gibborim or the spirits of the giants.
I know that we can, we probably all have we haven't talked about it specifically, but the etymology of Nephilim being not to fall from the Hebrew, from the word nephal, but from an Aramaic word meaning a giant. That aside,
Nephil.
Walter Zimmerli, in his Ezekiel commentary on this very passage, Derek, I don't know if you came across this, but he argues that the Gibborim are also actually in that passage called Nephilim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Through the word fall.
They do not lie with the mighty, the fallen from among the uncircumcised,
fallen.
Right?
And so he actually argues that you could translate that Nephilim, which, that seems to bring all these ideas together of these creatures on the other side, that the scripture actually is taking that as these giants.
Yeah. Because
Derek, where's the fall? Where's that verse about the fall?
That is in verse 27.
27?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I was way down there.
Yeah.
Okay.
ESV, they do not lie with the mighty, the fallen from among the uncircumcised. But Doug's point is that the word translated fallen, which is what, Nephilim?
Okay. Nephil?
Should be repointed to read Nephilim.
Nephilim.
But again, the Septuagint makes it clear that they understood that that was the point of the verse. They slept with the giants who had fallen from eternity. What a great turn of phrase. They had fallen from eternity. And that's who you're dealing with, these spirits in Sheol, the Rephaim.
Now, interestingly, we want to bring this together too, because Rephaim is also, it's one of these very fluid words, because Rephaim are also described as the giants in the land that David was wiping out. So we have sort of clans of Rephaim, and sometimes the Rephaim are also called Anakim or Zamzumim, right? So Rephaim seems to be if you look up that word throughout the days of David, right, you see that it's a term related to these giants. So there's obviously spiritual connection that's being made between these clans of giant beings that David was hunting down and wiping out, or that were hunting David, right? But he was, he was taking them out, and they're connecting that by name to those demonic, underworld entities. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. There's that theological connection that is justifying, why he's wiping them out, basically.
What was really interesting, and I cited your book, your novel about David, in a couple of things that we've written about this, because we looked at 2 Samuel 21, beginning at verse 15, which is that section of 2 Samuel where David almost gets killed by Ishvi ben Ov, and you brilliantly pointed out that that means Ishvi, son of the medium. But I stumbled onto some research by a Hittitologist named Harry Hoffner, who 1966 wrote that the word Ov actually derives from a Hurrian term, Abi, which means necromantic ritual pit. And they found one in a site in northern Syria, the site of ancient Urkesh, which was the main Hurrian power center until the time of the Exodus, about 15th century BC. This ritual pit went down about 45 feet, and they could only get down about halfway. But Hoffner argued that word, that Hurrian word Abi, was the original from which not only do we get the Hebrew word Ov, which more properly translated means owner of a ritual pit, it also is the original of the Sumerian word Abzu.
Oh, right.
In other words, he argued that the Sumerian the Hurrian couldn't come from the Sumerian. The Sumerian came from the Hurrian. And so that's really interesting, because the Hurrians are a very ancient people. We can trace back to like the 5th millennium BC in the plains of Ararat, which is where I connected them to Judd's paper on the Rephaim.
Well, forgive me, but
go ahead. Entire region through is there is such a flow of ideation relevant to what we're talking about here now. Doug, you referenced the etymological roots of the word Nephilim not coming from, the lower portions of the Levant, but it's got an Aramaic anchor, not unlike the word for watcher in Hebrew. Irim, it's related, directly descended from the Aramaic Irim, which interestingly enough means city. Mm-hmm. So you've got some insight into the kind of fallen, demonic sort of cultural engineering that's taking place with this rough counterfeit of Yahweh's kingdom trying to be recreated by these fallen entities on the earth. And so much of that information is flowing throughout the ancient Near East from this nexus point in northern Syria, southern Turkey, northern Mesopotamia. And this is where all these big ponds are happening now, with like places like Göbekli Tepe and Novali Chari and Karahan Tepe. This area is becoming exponentially more relevant and important to this topic almost on a weekly basis.
Wow.
I can see already that we're going to have to do a second program on this. Maybe just do this one on demons. We'll do angels on the next one, because we're 40 minutes in and we really haven't gotten to the different angels there. And that is going to be something to cover too, because there's a connection. And the only place watchers are mentioned in the Bible is Daniel 4, but they're mentioned in parallel with the holy ones. And that's a whole nother thing, because the Kedeshim are translated as the saints later in the book of Daniel, and that has some really interesting prophetic implications, but that would be a whole new rabbit trail.
There are a couple of other places that it's possible to read Watcher. I forget what they are off the top of my head, but I think there's one in Ezekiel, one in Amos, that they're based on that same word city, that some scholars have said that it is possible that you could translate this as Watcher there. So
I think we've talked about that in a previous program, actually, because Sharon and I wrote that into I think we wrote that into Veneration or Giants, Gods, and Dragons, one or the other. But one of them is Isaiah 14, because you get to verse 21 where it says, what is it? Declare destruction on his children for the sins of their fathers. May the offspring of evildoers never more be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth. Yes, this was a Veneration because we put that verse on the cover. Lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities.
Interesting.
what is the verse?
Of course,
Isaiah
it's
what?
in Isaiah 14. It has to be because that chapter has everything else in it. So
Yeah.
why not?
Isaiah 14:21.
Got it. Thanks.
And then
That's
the
amazing.
other place that is really interesting, I thought, was Numbers 24, which is the messianic prophecy of Balaam. You know, I see him, but not now. Beginning at verse 17, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Verse 19, one from Jacob shall exercise dominion. Clearly, that's a reference to the prophesied Messiah, and destroy the survivors of cities. Destroy the survivors of the Watchers.
I'm sorry, I missed that one. What was that?
That's
second one you mentioned?
Numbers 24, verse 19.
Those are good. To me, it's a lot like stars and sons of God. You know how in Job 38:7 they're parallel with each other. In the ancient mind, to say, well, which one is it? They would have said yes.
Well, in a way, many of these are all terms of the same beings, right? Sons of God. If you look through all the passages, you see concomitant phrases and concepts being applied to them, to the same beings called sons of God, sons of the Most High, holy ones.
Holy ones. Yep.
I believe watchers, but
Yep.
Watchers may be certain specific sons of God, right? But particularly sons of God also are called what else? There's several terms. My holy ones. Off the top of my head, I'm losing it.
Well,
but
they're called stars.
right? Yeah, stars, because they're equated. The celestial beings.
Yeah.
They're equated with the stars, and so it's important to understand that all these are used interchangeably, and that's why when you bring all these passages together, you see a much more fuller picture of these beings known as sons of God. Heavenly host. That's what I was thinking of. The heavenly host, which we know surrounds God's throne. And so they are, in essence, they are beings who are God's servants, like in 2 Kings, is it? You know, they perform God's functions, and these sons of God are these high creatures, and they also worship God, etc. Right? So is the concept is that some of these sons of God in Genesis 6 actually came to earth, and those were the ones that mated with women. And so those were the fallen, if anything, those were the fallen heavenly beings, right? And then their progeny was the Nephilim. So that's where all this heavenly imagery is connected with the earthly imagery of these mighty beings who are bad people, who are connected to the Rephaim and the spirit beings. But it's sort of like a package of the same thing in some ways, right? At least that's how I see it.
I think that's true. For the most part. So, like, for example, the host of heaven, I would think that would be a little bit bigger term encompassing more creatures than just the sons of God.
Oh, okay.
Because there's other creatures that are up there. And it's the whole host of heaven that worships Yahweh. So it's not just the sons of God that's worshiping, and everybody else kind of just doesn't have to. But, you know, I guess I would challenge people to think about some of these New Testament terms as well. And I don't know that, I think they all overlap. I don't know that they're all identical. But if you have something like a throne or a prince or a principality, those are all sharing almost the exact same ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you have something like maybe a power, that's a little bit different of a term. So you could have different kinds of powers. I was just thinking, I think Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the different bodies, heavenly bodies, earthly bodies. And I think he says, not all bodies are of the same glory, and some stars have different glory than others. So perhaps, the ancients thought of different kinds of entities as stars, not just sons of God, but certainly the sons of God were considered stars. So I think that you have some of that, genus species sort of thing going on.
There's an interesting observation that Tim Alvarino made in his book, Birthright. And we had the opportunity to talk with him about this, pointing out that in the parable of the prodigal son, which is essentially a picture of humanity's journey to rejoin the divine council. I mean, we've sold ourselves out to the swineherd, who's the one in charge of breeding these unclean animals. And finally, the son comes to himself It says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? And he returns home. The father, of course, greets him and puts a ring on him, puts a robe on him, and says to one of the servants to, kill the fatted calf. And the older son, the elder brother, representing the angels who remain faithful, is kind of cheesed about this. Look, I've served you faithfully for all these years, and now you're welcoming him back. He squandered his inheritance, this wonderful planet that we were given, and you're welcoming him back. But Tim asked a very interesting question. Who are these hired servants? Who are these other servants? I mean, if the older son, the older brother, is the angel in the story, and we're the younger brother, the prodigal kid coming back home through the grace of Jesus Christ, who are these servants? Just interesting thought. Now, maybe they're just there for, for narrative,
yeah. But yes, because not every component of a parable has a specific reference.
Yeah.
Right. We all learned that in seminary, don't you know?
Don't you know? Well, but
I suddenly feel compelled to twist my mustache.
And what a good mustache it is, too, Judd.
But I think
thank you.
What Doug was referring to, that Ephesians 6 talks about we do not wrestle against flesh and blood,
right,
but against the rulers, right? That's archon, and against the authorities.
And some of these, by the way, just to pause you there, Brian, some of these, by the way, I believe have a human and supernatural overlap.
That's what I'm getting to. Authorities, cosmic powers, dunamis, I think it is, of this present darkness against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Now, I tend to think of this as being sort of a generic, these are like interchangeable terms. He's just sort of, Paul often is what's the word where I can't remember the word, but where he just waxes eloquent and over again to say the same thing. I'm okay with that. Others think that means no, there are actual specific taxonomies of specific spiritual powers. But I think the generic, the most important point is it's clear that he's talking about spiritual heavenly places powers, right? And so elsewhere in Ephesians and even Colossians, he makes references where he talks about, if the powers had known about this, about the gospel, they wouldn't have crucified our Christ. And many Christians will say, well, that's just talking about earthly powers. But if you know that contextually, when he's using those terms, he's using them consistently. He's referring to spiritual powers, but as you said, Doug, as we understand, the ancient world, and particularly the biblical writers as well, believed that they were one with the heavenly powers. The earthly powers were one with the heavenly powers, as above, so below. So This is the whole, on earth as it is in heaven. So the ancient world concept was that earthly powers were connected to heavenly powers. So if there was a war on earth, there was a war in heaven. And that's where you get the Prince of Persia versus the Prince of Greece in Daniel, reflecting the very fact that Persia was taking, or I'm sorry, Greece was going to be taking away the power from Persia over the earth, et cetera, right? And so when you understand that, then you see that when Paul is just referring to the rulers or the authorities in other passages of Ephesians or Colossians, or maybe even elsewhere in the New Testament, he's not necessarily talking about just earthly powers. He's actually talking about earthly and heavenly powers connected, sure, but I think in this case he's focusing on the in Ephesians 6 for sure. He's focusing on the spiritual powers, but it's applied to the other passages. What's the other one, Doug, in Ephesians where he's talking about if they had known, they wouldn't have crucified.
That's
the Lord of
1 Corinthians 2, verse 6.
First
6 through 8.
2, 6.
Yeah, 2, 6, 7, and 8.
Yeah, the rulers of this thing.
This isn't just a New Testament thing either. When I was preaching through Psalm 2 a few years ago, it really struck me, these famous words from the Messiah, the Hannah put for us, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? So, okay, is there a distinction there? Maybe. But what about the next one? And the kings of the earth set themselves, and the archons take counsel together. Well, why would he say the kings of the earth and then just say the same exact thing? I think it's very possible that he's distinguishing between the kings of the earth, on the earth, and the archons in heaven, that they are taking counsel together against who? Well, in that same verse, you have against Yahweh and Mashiach. And then two verses later, he who sits in heaven laughs, and the Lord holds him in derision. You have two again there. So you've got the Heavenly Father, first power, and second power, the Lord, Adonai. And so it seems to me that the psalmist is doing this in several different places. And so it's not just something that we find in the New Testament. The Old Testament is doing the same thing.
It's maybe more obvious in the New Testament. There are more different terms in the Greek that are applied than in the Hebrew, because they're the kings of the earth. That's based on melech. The rulers, that's prince, rosh, or head or chief, not prince. The word for prince is different. You've got a number of different words in the Greek that enter in with the Septuagint and into the New Testament then. But at the same time, and this, with the Hellenization of the world after Alexander the Great, you get this these Second Temple Enochic books that start getting very specific about where demons come from. The book of First Enoch, and some of these terms that we're seeing in the New Testament applied to these spiritual beings, like exousia or arche or archon or dynamis, stoicheia, elemental spirit. And from what I could find, that this was not commonly done prior really to the Christian era. And really, it's not before you start seeing the Book of Enoch in the 3rd century BC that you get very specific information about the origin of demons, which parallels what the Greek poet Hesiod was writing about the origin of these demons in the 6th or 7th century BC, where he wrote that the what was the term he used for humans? The moropes anthropoi. Yeah, and again, Amar Anus pointed out that word moropes is based on the same Semitic root as Rephaim. The moropes anthropoi, the men who lived during the golden age when Kronos ruled in heaven, the king of the Titans, before he was overthrown and sent down to Tartarus, like the sons of God from Genesis 6. When they died, they became daemons and wandered about the earth helping humanity. And interesting that the early church didn't translate daemon into a Hebrew word. They just transliterated it as demon. So what we see in the book of First Enoch is what the Greeks believed about the origin of these spirits. It's just the nature of those spirits was very different. The Greeks believed that they were kindly and helpful as long as you sacrificed to them. Continuing the practice from the Canaanites, the point of Amar Anus's paper, which was titled "Were There Greek Rephaim?" was that the Greeks got the practice of hero worship, Heracles and Theseus and Perseus, from the Canaanites, the Amorites, and their veneration of the Rephaim. So again, First Enoch, the Book of the Watchers, seems to sort of put this into a Hebrew context, a Jewish context, but it seems to be drawing on ideas that came from the Greeks, who in turn were just recycling religion from the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel.
Or maybe they all had a common source
before that.
And in other words, it wasn't just that the Greeks took over a new culture and said, okay, we're going to assimilate everything that they have, like the Borg, but they could have had these kind of ideas going on before as well, because everybody came from a common source.
Yeah. And there was more cultural cross-pollination than we've been taught. I was interested to learn that the term in the Bible, the people, the Hivites, probably a Hebrewized version of the Luvian name Achiyawa, which was their term. That's like a southern Turkish, they were southern neighbors of the Hittites, and that was their word for the Mycenaean Greeks. So the Hivites were in the land. Yeah.
The Keans, that cache of documents references all the major places and names of the Trojan War.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hivites were essentially Greeks, and they were in the Bible. And in the vicinity of Mount Hermon, by the way, Joshua had to do battle with them in the vicinity of Mount Hermon. So it's not surprising that we found that Charles Warren found that Greek stone on the temple on the summit of Mount Hermon, By order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. Well, fellas, we're about an hour in. Can we continue this and maybe get more into the New Testament terms for angels and what these different terms mean, and just continue this conversation next month?
There's a lot here, Derek. I think I would like to see us talk about the difference between, like a ghost and a demon.
Okay.
So kind of entering into how do the human dead play in this as well? Because I think there's a lot of confusion about that, and especially when you come to the Torah and how it forbids certain kinds of things, like what exactly is it forbidding? So I think there's quite a bit of room here for us to keep going.
Yeah, well, I'd get 2 more months out of this, which is fine with me. Because it's weird, it's interesting, but it's also kind of important, because I think we all know people who consider themselves Christians who still have not ever been given good teaching when it comes to the spirit realm. And since the Bible is supposed to be our guidebook in how we interact with the spirit realm, since that's where we're going to spend the rest of eternity, it's kind of important that we dig into this and get it right.
And I think it's helpful too for, again, the evangelical background that I come from, which tends to sort of, just sort of reason away the whole spiritual thing as being just not that relevant, and reinterpreting a lot of these spiritual passages in terms of earthly powers and such, so that they don't have to deal with it. But I think it's important for all of us as Christians to have to face this and realize the reality of this stuff going on. Again, I'm speaking from the background that I come from, a very sort of a anti-supernatural Christianity, So I think that's why I like doing this, because it forces me to really see that reality and seek to try to embrace it and understand it in a way that then applies to my life. This stuff is not just in the past in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. So how does it apply?
Amen. Well said. Brian Godawa, best-selling author, award-winning screenwriter. You find his work at godawa.com. Pastor Doug Van Dorn, Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder. His website, douglasvandorn.com. And Dr. Judd Burton, our friendly neighborhood PhD, director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, burtonbeyond.com. Guys, always fascinating, and look forward to doing this again next month. You'll find links to our guests' website in the websites, that is, in the show notes, whether you're watching or listening, even on the app. The developers of our free app have now included the ability to hot link in the notes. So if you're using the mobile app on a mobile device, you can find the links right there. I'll make sure that they're in the notes. But if you're watching at YouTube or wherever else, just check the notes and follow those notes to Doug, Brian, and Judd's websites as we continue to try to triangulate or quadrangulate, I guess, since there's 4 of us, on what the Bible really has for us. God has miraculously preserved this word for us for 2,000 years, and he has redeemed us with his own blood. So it's kind of really falls to us as an obligation, or just as a way of saying thank you. Thank you, my King, to try to understand his word to the best of our ability. And because of the tools available to us now through the internet, free tools, we can do this in ways that the great theologians of years gone by never could. So let's keep digging. Next month, we're going to start with a conversation that we had wanted to include this month, and we kind of rabbit trailed. And I try to keep these to about an hour or a little over, just to keep them to a manageable length. But why was there such an explosion of demonic activity? Or why did Jesus focus so much attention on the activity of demons during his ministry? I mean, there's really not a single incident, not a single case in the Old Testament of any of the prophets casting out demons. We see a hint of something like that when David played his lyre to soothe the troubled spirit of Saul, who was being tormented by an evil spirit. But that wasn't deliverance. It wasn't an exorcism, and yet we see that frequently in the New Testament. Why is that? So we'll discuss that next week and get into some of the various words used by Paul and the other writers in the New Testament to describe these beings from the spirit realm. Please take advantage of our mobile app. I've talked about this before, but I can't stress this enough. And while you're doing this, check out the More tab. It's on the far right of the app. That gets you links to some other things that we are connected with. One of those, of course, is our store. We've always got a group of specials that are available during at any given time, really. Something else we're starting now is our streaming video service. We are putting together some of our teachings and making those available, and documentaries, really, making those available for you to stream as well. Because especially if you're overseas, the cost of shipping and the delay between the time you order and the time it gets there can be onerous. And again, especially if you're overseas. And the cost of mailing a DVD to you is more than the cost of the DVD itself. Maybe it's better to stream it. So we've got a new streaming video site. We've not really talked about it much as we're kind of soft launching it, wanting to make sure that it works, and everything seems to be going well. So we've got our 2 documentary videos of our Israel tours that are available out there. We're also putting more individual teachings up on this website as well. You'll find it at gilberthouse.org/video, gilberthouse.org/video, instant access, high definition video. And best of all, you don't have to pay for shipping or VAT if you live somewhere that charges that. So, and then we don't have to worry about making sure we've got customs documents that are correct. There's software that does it for us, but it's just easier all the way around. Check it out. You may find some things that are useful to you, and we pray that it is a blessing to you. You can follow us on social media. We're at View from Bunker on Twitter, or at Derek Gilbert. That's my personal Twitter account. Facebook, View from the Bunker. And we're also up on the new social media sites, trying to keep up with all of these new developments. Truth Social, Gab Me, We Get Her Parlor, at Derek P. Gilbert. A couple of things to tell you about. First of all, we're going to be in Blue Eye, Missouri. That's Morningside Church, as Sharon and I will be guesting on the Jim Bakker Show. This recording session will be on February the 2nd. February 2nd is what day of the week is that? Is that a Thursday? Yes, it is a Thursday. Those are open and open to the public and free. You don't have to pay to get in. So if you're in southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and or just visiting the Ozarks, and you'd like to come down and meet us there, we've got information at our website, the right-hand column at gilberthouse.org. Also on the app, there's a calendar on the app that leads you to our events, and we're kind of looking forward to this one. This should be a fun discussion. We're going to be talking about the Great Reset and End Times Prophecy. Again, the appearance at the Jim Bakker Show on February 2nd. We'll be in Israel on March 19th through 30th with the optional 3-day extension to Jordan. If you're thinking about joining us, really the time is growing very, very short. Not many seats left on that third bus. But if you want to find out more, lipkintours.com, or just go to our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Really, that's easier, because then from there you can link directly to the page for our tour with Lipkin Tours. They're good people there, Aaron and Eddie Lipkin. In fact, Aaron will be traveling across the United States this summer. And we look forward to him coming through, and hopefully we can get together with him. But he'll be speaking at churches all across the country on archaeology and the Holy Land, which is a subject near and dear to our hearts. We've agreed to speak at the Go Therefore conference coming up in July 28th through 30th at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookline, Ohio. That's just outside Dayton. Details on registration and other speakers still to come, but we will give those to you as soon as we get them. And we're still working towards a tour of Turkey in the fall, the Churches of Revelation, Göbekli Tepe, and more. And as soon as we get information on those firm details, we will pass those along to you. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our special thanks to our announcer, D.C. Good, and to you for giving us your time this week. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.